When people talk about the most tragic places in Naruto, the conversation usually begins with the hidden leaf. They talk about the Uchiha massacre. They talk about Pain's attack. They talk about the Nine Tails and the long list of shinobi who gave their lives protecting the village. But if you step back and look at the history of the 5 great nations as a whole, another village quietly stands apart from all the others. Not because it suffered one great tragedy, because it never seemed to escape tragedy at all. The hidden sand was not cursed by a tailed beast. It was not destroyed by a legendary villain. It was not haunted by an ancient blood feud stretching back generations. Instead, Sunagakure faced something much harder to defeat. Its greatest enemy was the world it was built in. From the very beginning, the hidden sand was fighting a battle that could never truly be won. While other villages benefited from forests, rivers, fertile land, and abundant resources, the land of wind offered little beyond endless stretches of desert. Water was precious. Agriculture was difficult. Trade routes were dangerous. Every aspect of daily life required more effort than it did elsewhere. Even before the first enemy shinobi appeared on the horizon, survival was already a challenge. That reality shaped everything that followed. It shaped the village's economy. It shaped its military. It shaped its leaders. Most importantly, it shaped its people. The history of the hidden sand is filled with individuals who were forced to make impossible choices. Again and again, its leaders found themselves trapped between 2 terrible options, choosing the one they believed would keep the village alive for another generation. Some of those decisions worked. Many of them did not. Nearly all of them left scars. Those scars accumulated over decades, then over generations, then across an entire century of shinobi history. The result was a village unlike any other in Naruto. While the hidden leaf often produced dreamers, the hidden sand produced survivors. Its shinobi grew up understanding hardship from an early age. They learned that security was fragile. They learned that resources could disappear. They learned that peace was often temporary. Most of all, they learned that the survival of the village frequently came before the happiness of the individual. No family illustrates this better than the family of the Kazekage. The rulers of the hidden sand were supposed to be symbols of strength. They were supposed to be the people who guided the village through difficult times. Yet when you examine their history, what you find instead is a long chain of sacrifice, regret, and loss. 1. Kazekage disappeared without a trace. Another spent years making increasingly desperate decisions to preserve a declining village. One of them ultimately turned his own son into a living weapon, and then spent years trying to destroy the very child he had created. That child was Gaara. When viewers first meet Gaara, he appears frightening, even by Naruto standards. He speaks casually about killing. He treats violence as something ordinary. He seems completely disconnected from other people and incapable of understanding basic human compassion. At first glance, he looks like a monster. In reality, he was one of the greatest victims in the entire series. Gaara's story is often presented as a personal tragedy, but it is also the story of the hidden sand itself. His suffering did not happen in isolation. It was the result of decades of political fear, military weakness, economic pressure, and desperate leadership decisions. The village created him because it believed it had no other choice. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout the history of Sunagakure. A grandmother loses her family to war and dedicates her life to creating deadlier weapons. A gifted child loses his parents and grows into one of the most dangerous missing nin in the world. A village facing financial decline places increasingly impossible expectations upon its leaders. Each tragedy seems connected to the one that came before it. Each generation inherits problems it did not create. Each generation attempts to solve them and leaves behind new problems for the next. What makes the hidden sand so fascinating is that there is rarely a clear villain responsible for its suffering. Most of the people involved genuinely wanted to protect their village. Most of them believed they were making the best decisions available. Most of them were trapped by circumstances larger than themselves. That is why the history of Sunagakure feels less like the story of a single disaster and more like the story of a community struggling to survive against impossible odds. Time after time, the village found itself facing challenges that would have broken weaker nations. Time after time, it endured. Yet endurance came at a cost measured in broken families, a cost measured in lost childhoods, a cost measured in generations of people forced to carry burdens they never asked for. By the end of this story, we will see how the hidden sand became the most tragic village in Naruto, how it produced some of the series' most complex characters, and how an entire nation spent decades fighting for survival in a world that seemed determined to make every step forward as difficult as possible. Because the history of the hidden sand is not really the story of a village. It is the story of what happens when an entire society is forced to survive for so long that survival becomes more important than everything else. Long before the hidden sand became known for Gaara, puppet masters, or the Kazekage, its fate was already being shaped by geography. This is one of the most important details in the entire history of Sunagakure, and it is also one of the most overlooked. When fans discuss the major villages of Naruto, they often focus on powerful clans, famous leaders, and military conflicts. What is rarely discussed is the fact that every village inherited a completely different set of advantages and disadvantages from the moment it was founded. The hidden leaf was surrounded by forests rich in resources. The hidden cloud possessed natural defenses created by massive mountain ranges. The hidden mist controlled important coastlines and maritime routes. Each village had problems of its own, but they also possessed environmental advantages that helped support their growth. The land of wind was different. The farther one traveled into its territory, the more unforgiving the landscape became. Vast deserts stretched across enormous distances. Water sources were limited. Productive farmland was scarce. Dust storms could appear without warning, and transform travel into a dangerous undertaking. Even maintaining supply lines required considerably more effort than it did in many neighboring nations. These conditions affected every aspect of life. A shinobi village cannot survive on military strength alone. It requires food, trade, infrastructure, and a stable population. Every nation depends upon economic resources to support its military institutions. The problem facing Sunagakure was that it had fewer resources to work with than many of its rivals. As a result, the hidden sand developed under constant pressure. While other villages could devote attention toward expansion and long-term growth, the sand often found itself focused on maintaining stability. Resources that might have been used for development were frequently redirected toward survival. Every shortage created new challenges. Every drought created new risks. Every economic downturn placed additional strain upon leaders who were already struggling to keep the village competitive. This reality produced a culture very different from the one that emerged in Konoha. The hidden leaf was founded upon Hashirama's dream of cooperation and community. While Konoha certainly experienced tragedy, it also benefited from periods of prosperity that allowed future generations to think beyond simple survival. Children could dream of becoming Hokage. Families could imagine better futures for their descendants. Hope became an important part of the village's identity. The hidden sand rarely enjoyed that luxury. Its leaders were often forced to think in terms of necessity rather than aspiration. Decisions were evaluated according to whether they improved the village's chances of survival. Over time, this practical mindset became deeply embedded within the culture itself. Strength mattered because weakness could have devastating consequences. Efficiency mattered because resources were limited. Sacrifice mattered because somebody always had to pay the cost. The village's military structure reflected these realities. Sunagakure became known for producing highly specialized shinobi, capable of maximizing limited resources. Puppet techniques emerged partly because they allowed users to fight efficiently without relying exclusively on manpower. Strategic thinking became essential because the village could not always afford prolonged conflicts. Innovation frequently arose from necessity rather than convenience. In many ways, the hidden sand became stronger because of its hardships. At the same time, those hardships created problems that never fully disappeared. The leaders of Sunagakure constantly faced a difficult question. How could they compete with larger, wealthier, and often more stable rivals without exhausting the resources they already lacked? Every generation answered that question differently, but none of them found a permanent solution. The consequences became especially visible during periods of war. The Great Ninja Wars affected every major nation, but the burden was rarely distributed equally. Wealthier villages could absorb losses more effectively. Villages with larger populations could replace personnel more easily. The hidden sand often found itself operating with narrower margins for error. A failed campaign could create problems that lingered for years. The loss of skilled shinobi could weaken entire sectors of the village's military capabilities. Over time, these pressures accumulated. The village survived. Then it survived again. Then it survived another crisis. But surviving and thriving are not the same thing. Generation after generation inherited unresolved problems from those who came before them. Leaders worked tirelessly to preserve stability, yet many of those efforts merely delayed larger issues rather than solving them completely. Economic pressures remained. Resource shortages remained. Political challenges remained. Eventually, these problems began influencing the decisions of the Kazekage themselves. Some leaders became increasingly cautious. Others became increasingly desperate. The village's difficult circumstances pushed many of them toward choices that would have seemed unthinkable elsewhere. This is what makes the Hidden Sands history so tragic. Its leaders were not usually driven by greed or ambition. Most of them genuinely wanted to protect their people. The problem was that protecting those people often required making decisions under conditions that would have challenged anyone. When resources are scarce, every mistake becomes more expensive. When security feels uncertain, every threat appears larger. When survival is never guaranteed, fear begins influencing judgment. Those pressures would eventually shape the actions of nearly every major figure in the village's history. They would shape Chiyo. They would shape Rasa. They would shape Gaara. They would even contribute to the creation of one of the most feared shinobi the world had ever seen. Long before those individuals entered the story, however, the Hidden Sand was already fighting an uphill battle against circumstances that seemed determined to hold it back. The village endured because its people refused to surrender. But endurance alone could not prevent tragedy. In many ways, the harsh environment surrounding Sunagakure planted the seeds for nearly every major disaster that would follow, creating a cycle of hardship that future generations would spend decades trying to escape. If there is one theme that appears again and again throughout the history of the Hidden Sand, it is the idea that every generation inherited problems it did not create. This cycle began long before Gaara was born, long before the third Kazekage disappeared, long before Sasori abandoned the village. The roots of the Hidden Sand's suffering can be traced back to the earliest years of its existence, when the leaders of the Land of Wind attempted to build one of the great shinobi nations in an environment that seemed determined to resist them at every turn. Unlike the Hidden Leaf, which was blessed with fertile land and abundant natural resources, Sunagakure was forced to compete from a position of disadvantage. Every village faced challenges, but the challenges facing the sand were permanent. They could not be defeated in battle. They could not be negotiated away through diplomacy. They could not be solved by producing stronger shinobi. The desert was always there. The scarcity was always there. The limitations were always there. As the years passed and the village expanded, these problems became more apparent rather than less. A larger population required more resources. A stronger military required more funding. Greater political influence required greater economic stability. Every step forward created new demands that the village struggled to meet. This placed enormous pressure upon the Kazekage. Many Naruto fans focus on the Hokage because the story spends most of its time in Konoha. But the Kazekage arguably had one of the most difficult jobs in the entire shinobi world. A Hokage inherited a village with strong infrastructure, powerful clans, and significant economic advantages. The Kazekage inherited a village that constantly had to fight for relevance in a system that favored stronger and wealthier nations. Success was difficult. Failure was expensive. Mediocrity was often dangerous. As a result, the leadership of the Hidden Sand developed a mindset that differed significantly from many of its rivals. Pragmatism became more important than idealism. Efficiency became more important than comfort. Survival became more important than almost everything else. This way of thinking influenced nearly every aspect of village life. The Sand produced highly disciplined shinobi because it needed them. It developed specialized combat styles because it needed them. It encouraged innovation because relying upon conventional advantages was not an option. The famous puppet techniques that eventually became synonymous with Sunagakure emerged partly because they allowed a single shinobi to control multiple weapons at once, maximizing effectiveness without requiring large numbers of personnel. Necessity drove innovation. Unfortunately, necessity also drove desperation. As decades passed, the balance of power among the great villages became increasingly important. The 5 great nations existed in a constant state of competition, even during periods of peace. Every village monitored the others. Every leader understood that weakness invited exploitation. Every military force served as both a shield and a warning. For the Hidden Sand, maintaining that balance became more difficult with each passing generation. The village simply lacked many of the advantages enjoyed by its rivals. This reality became painfully obvious whenever economics entered the equation. Most shinobi villages relied heavily upon mission contracts. Wealthy clients, merchants, nobles, and governments paid hidden villages to perform services ranging from simple escorts to high-risk intelligence operations. These contracts generated income that allowed villages to train shinobi, maintain infrastructure, and fund future development. The Hidden Leaf excelled in this system. Konoha possessed more personnel, greater resources, and a stronger reputation. As a result, many clients naturally preferred doing business with the Leaf. Even the feudal lord of the Land of Wind increasingly began outsourcing missions to Konoha rather than his own village. To the Hidden Sand, this felt like a slow-moving disaster. Every contract lost to another village represented money, leaving the local economy. Every missing source of revenue increased financial pressure. Every year made the situation slightly worse. The decline was gradual enough that nobody could point to a single moment when everything changed. But the overall trend was impossible to ignore. The village was struggling, and many of its leaders knew it. This is where one of the most tragic aspects of Sunagakure's history begins to emerge. The village's future became increasingly dependent upon extraordinary individuals. When resources are plentiful, institutions matter more than people. Strong systems can survive the loss of even talented leaders. When resources are scarce, however, exceptional individuals become incredibly important. A single genius can alter the fate of an entire nation. The hidden sand desperately needed such people. It needed legendary shinobi. It needed brilliant strategists. It needed symbols capable of restoring confidence. Fortunately, the village eventually produced several remarkable figures. Unfortunately, nearly all of them were destined for tragedy. Chiyo would become one of the greatest puppet masters in history, but she would spend much of her life watching war destroy the younger generation. Sasori would become a prodigy, unlike anything the village had ever seen. Yet his grief would eventually transform him into a missing nin feared throughout the world. Rasa would inherit leadership during one of the most difficult periods in the village's history, and gradually become consumed by the pressure of preserving it. Even Gaara, who would eventually save the village from itself, began life as a victim of the very system he later helped reform. The pattern is difficult to ignore. Again and again, Sunagakure produced remarkable people. Again and again, those people suffered. Again and again, the village placed enormous burdens upon individuals and hoped they would somehow solve problems that had been accumulating for decades. This is why the hidden sand feels fundamentally different from many other villages in Naruto. Its tragedies were rarely isolated events. They were connected. One generation's decisions became the next generation's problems. One crisis led directly into another. One sacrifice created the conditions for future sacrifices. By the time the third Kazekage rose to power, the village was already carrying decades of economic strain, political anxiety, and strategic uncertainty. The people desperately wanted a leader who could reverse the trend and restore the village's standing in the world. For a brief period, it appeared that they had finally found exactly that person. Many considered the third Kazekage the greatest leader Sunagakure had ever produced. His power was legendary. His reputation was unmatched. His future seemed capable of changing the destiny of the entire village. For the first time in many years, the hidden sand appeared to have genuine reason for optimism. That optimism would not last, because the story of the third Kazekage is not the story of how the hidden sand escaped its curse. It is the story of how the village lost its greatest hope and unknowingly helped create one of the darkest tragedies in its entire history. By the time the third Kazekage rose to power, the hidden sand had spent decades fighting against challenges that seemed woven into the very fabric of its existence. Economic limitations, geographic disadvantages, and growing competition from rival villages had created a constant sense of uncertainty about the future. Although Sunagakure remained one of the 5 great villages, maintaining that status required increasingly difficult sacrifices, and many people wondered whether the village could continue competing with stronger and wealthier nations over the long term. For a brief period, those fears appeared to fade. The third Kazekage emerged as the kind of leader every struggling nation hopes to find during difficult times. He possessed extraordinary talent, immense political importance, and a reputation that extended far beyond the borders of the land of wind. Even among the leaders of the great villages, he was regarded as an exceptional shinobi. Years later, many would still remember him as the strongest Kazekage in the history of the hidden sand. What made him so valuable was not simply his power. The village had produced strong shinobi before. What made the third Kazekage special was that he represented stability at a time when stability was desperately needed. Sunagakure had spent much of its history reacting to problems, adapting to hardships, and searching for ways to compensate for disadvantages that never disappeared. Under the third Kazekage, there was finally a sense that the village might be moving toward a more secure future. His most famous ability was the iron sand technique, a unique combat style developed through his study of the one-tail's jinchuriki. By manipulating magnetic forces, he could control vast quantities of metallic sand with extraordinary precision. The technique was devastating in battle and versatile enough to handle a wide range of situations. Opponents who underestimated it often discovered that they were fighting one of the most dangerous abilities in the shinobi world. Over time, stories about his strength spread throughout the nations. His reputation became one of the hidden sand's greatest assets. In a world where military power often determined political influence, the existence of a leader as formidable as the third Kazekage served as a powerful deterrent. Rival villages understood that any direct confrontation with Sunagakure would come at a tremendous cost. For a village that had spent so long feeling vulnerable, that reputation carried enormous value. Just as important was the effect he had upon his own people. Strong leaders create confidence. They reassure citizens that someone capable is guiding the village through uncertain times. They provide a sense of continuity that allows communities to think beyond immediate survival. Although many of the hidden sand's underlying problems remained unresolved, the presence of the third Kazekage made those problems feel more manageable. For perhaps the first time in generations, there was genuine optimism about the future. The village still faced economic difficulties. It still occupied one of the harshest environments in the shinobi world. It still lacked many of the advantages enjoyed by larger rivals. Yet people could look at their leader and believe that those obstacles might eventually be overcome. Unfortunately, this period of relative stability would prove far shorter than anyone expected. One of the recurring tragedies in the history of the hidden sand is that moments of hope rarely lasted long enough to solve the problems that created them. Again and again, the village seemed poised to move forward, only to suffer another devastating setback. The story of the third Kazekage follows this pattern so perfectly that it almost feels symbolic of Sunagakure's entire history. At the height of his influence, when his leadership appeared most secure and his future seemed brightest, he suddenly vanished. No dramatic battle was witnessed. No invasion occurred. No public explanation was given. The strongest Kazekage in the village's history simply disappeared. The shock cannot be overstated. When ordinary shinobi vanish, villages mourn the loss of a valuable asset. When a leader of the third Kazekage's stature disappears, the consequences ripple through every level of society. Political stability is threatened. Public confidence is shaken. Questions begin spreading better than answers. For the people of the hidden sand, the disappearance was both a personal tragedy and a national crisis. The village immediately began searching for explanations. Had another nation assassinated him? Had he been captured? Had some unknown enemy emerged from the shadows? Every possibility seemed alarming, because none of them reflected well on the village's security. If someone could eliminate a shinobi as powerful as the third Kazekage, what did that imply about everyone else? What nobody realized at the time was that the answer would be far more painful than any foreign conspiracy. The individual responsible was not a rival Kage. He was not a legendary warrior from another nation. He was not the leader of some hidden organization. The person responsible had once been one of the Hidden Sand's own greatest prodigies. His name was Sasori. The same village that had desperately searched for a symbol of hope had unknowingly created the individual who would destroy that hope. In a cruel twist that perfectly reflects the history of Sunagakure, one of its brightest talents would become the architect of one of its darkest tragedies. The disappearance of the third Kazekage did more than remove a powerful leader. It robbed the village of stability at precisely the moment it needed stability most. The consequences would linger for years, creating uncertainty within the leadership, weakening confidence in the future, and contributing to the cycle of hardship that continued defining the Hidden Sand. As later generations struggled to understand what had happened, very few of them realized that the answer began years earlier with a lonely child whose life had already been shaped by war, grief, and a loss he never truly recovered from. The disappearance of the third Kazekage was not merely the loss of a leader. It was the moment the Hidden Sand lost the future it had been trying to build. To understand why this event was so devastating, it is important to remember the position Sunagakure occupied at the time. Unlike some of the other great villages, the Hidden Sand could not easily absorb major setbacks. The village had spent generations struggling against economic limitations, geographic disadvantages, and political pressures that seemed to grow more severe with every passing decade. Progress was often slow and difficult, which meant that every success carried enormous importance. The third Kazekage represented one of those successes. He was not simply a powerful shinobi whose name inspired fear on the battlefield. He was proof that the Hidden Sand could still produce greatness despite everything working against it. He symbolized competence, stability, and strength during a period when the village desperately needed all three. For many citizens, his leadership likely offered reassurance that the future would be better than the past. That reassurance vanished overnight. When a village loses an ordinary leader, succession plans can often minimize the damage. When a village loses the strongest Kazekage in its history under mysterious circumstances, the resulting uncertainty spreads through every layer of society. Rumors begin replacing facts. Confidence begins giving way to anxiety. People start asking questions that nobody can answer. How could someone so powerful disappear? Who was responsible? Could it happen again? The absence of answers made the situation even worse. In many ways, uncertainty is more frightening than bad news. A painful truth at least provides something concrete to confront. Mystery creates endless possibilities, and human beings often imagine possibilities far worse than reality. As the months passed, without clear explanations, the disappearance of the third Kazekage became one of the most troubling mysteries in the shinobi world. The hidden sand searched relentlessly. Resources were devoted to investigations. Shinobi were dispatched to gather information. Leaders attempted to piece together what had happened. Yet every effort seemed to produce more questions rather than solutions. What nobody knew was that the answer had been quietly developing for years. The tragedy did not begin with the third Kazekage. It began with a child. Like many of the most heartbreaking stories in Naruto, the roots of the disaster can be traced back to war. Sasori was born into a generation that inherited the consequences of constant conflict. During the wars that shaped the shinobi world, countless families were torn apart. Parents disappeared on missions and never returned. Children grew up surrounded by stories of sacrifice, loss, and duty. For many villages, these experiences were painful. For the hidden sand, they became almost routine. Sasori's parents were among the casualties. They died while serving the village, leaving him in the care of his grandmother, Chiyo. Chiyo loved her grandson deeply and did everything she could to help him cope with the loss. As one of the greatest puppet masters in history, she even used her skills to create puppet replicas of his parents. She hoped these creations might ease his loneliness and provide comfort during an unimaginably difficult period of his childhood. The gesture was heartfelt. It was also tragically insufficient. The puppets could resemble his parents. They could not replace them. This distinction became one of the defining forces in Sasori's life. As he grew older, he became increasingly fascinated with puppetry. What began as a skill eventually evolved into an obsession. Unlike human beings, puppets did not age. They did not leave. They did not die unexpectedly. They remained exactly as they were, frozen in time and untouched by loss. To a child traumatized by abandonment and grief, that idea held enormous appeal. The more Sasori suffered, the more he gravitated toward things that could never disappear. At first, his talent was celebrated. Like many prodigies in Naruto, Sasori displayed extraordinary abilities from a remarkably young age. His intelligence, creativity, and technical mastery quickly distinguished him from his peers. People saw a gifted young shinobi with the potential to become one of the hidden sand's greatest assets. Very few recognized the emotional wounds developing beneath the surface. This is another recurring tragedy within the history of Sunagakure. The village became exceptionally skilled at producing strong shinobi, but it often struggled to recognize the suffering hidden behind that strength. As long as individuals continued performing their duties and contributing to the village, the deeper causes of their pain frequently went unnoticed. Sasori's brilliance disguised his loneliness. His accomplishments concealed his grief. His success prevented others from realizing how disconnected he was becoming from the people around him. As the years passed, his worldview grew increasingly distorted. Where most people saw relationships as meaningful because they were temporary, Sasori began viewing impermanence itself as a flaw. He watched people age, suffer, and die. He watched emotions create vulnerability. He watched the passage of time destroy everything that mattered to him. Rather than accepting these realities as part of life, he began searching for ways to escape them. Puppets offered an answer. Unlike human beings, they could be preserved forever. Unlike human beings, they could be controlled completely. Unlike human beings, they would never abandon him. This philosophy gradually pushed him further away from ordinary human connection. While others formed friendships and families, Sasori became increasingly consumed by his pursuit of permanence. The very qualities that made him a genius also accelerated his isolation, creating a feedback loop that grew more dangerous with each passing year. Eventually, the distance between Sasori and the rest of the village became impossible to ignore. The talented child, who had once represented hope for the future, was slowly transforming into someone who viewed humanity itself as deeply flawed. The pain of losing his parents had evolved into a broader rejection of the impermanence that defines human life. Instead of healing, he had built an entire philosophy around avoiding grief. That philosophy would ultimately lead him down a path from which there was no return. For the hidden sand, the consequences would be catastrophic. Because while the village was searching for strong leaders capable of securing its future, one of its own prodigies was quietly moving toward a decision that would shatter that future entirely. The mystery surrounding the third Kazekage would eventually be solved, but the truth would be more horrifying than anyone imagined. The strongest leader in the history of the hidden sand had not been defeated by a rival nation or a legendary enemy. He had fallen victim to a tragedy that began inside his own village, carried out by a child whom that very village had failed to save. The story of Sasori is often remembered as the story of a villain. The story of Chiyo is often remembered as the story of a hero seeking redemption. What makes their relationship so tragic is that neither description fully captures what actually happened. At its core, their story is about two generations of the hidden sand being damaged by the same cycle of war, loss, and sacrifice. Chiyo and Sasori stood on opposite sides by the end of their lives, but they were both products of the same village and the same history. Both had watched people they loved disappear. Both had spent years trying to cope with grief. Both were shaped by a world where death was so common that entire generations learned to expect it. The difference was that they responded to that suffering in very different ways. By the time Sasori's parents died, Chiyo had already witnessed more tragedy than most people could imagine. She had lived through multiple wars. She had watched countless shinobi leave for missions and never return. She had seen families destroyed by conflicts that often seemed endless. Like many members of her generation, she accepted these losses as part of life because the shinobi world offered few alternatives. That acceptance came at a cost. The older generation of Sunagakure became extraordinarily resilient, but resilience sometimes concealed wounds that never truly healed. People learned how to endure grief without necessarily processing it. They learned how to continue functioning after devastating losses. They learned how to bury painful memories because survival demanded it. Chiyo was no exception. When Sasori lost his parents, She desperately wanted to spare him from the suffering she knew so well. She wanted to fill the emptiness left behind by their deaths. She wanted to protect him from becoming another casualty of a world that seemed determined to take everything from the people living within it. Unfortunately, love alone could not solve the problem. The loneliness consuming Sasori ran deeper than anyone realized. Children often process grief differently than adults. They may not fully understand death, but they understand absence. They understand the feeling of waiting for someone who never comes home. They understand the silence left behind when a familiar voice disappears forever. For Sasori, those experiences became defining features of his childhood. While other children formed memories with their parents, he was left trying to preserve memories that already existed. While other children looked toward the future, he became increasingly obsessed with the past. The tragedy is that many warning signs were visible long before he left the village. His growing obsession with puppets was frequently interpreted as evidence of his extraordinary talent. In many ways, that interpretation was correct. Sasori was unquestionably a genius. His mastery of puppet techniques exceeded what most shinobi could accomplish in a lifetime. He created inventions that pushed the art form far beyond its traditional limits. His intelligence and creativity were so remarkable that even experienced masters struggled to comprehend the speed of his development. Yet beneath that talent was a much darker motivation. Sasori was not simply creating puppets because he enjoyed the craft. He was trying to create permanence. Every important relationship in his life had taught him the same lesson. Human beings leave. Human beings die. Human beings change. No matter how precious something becomes, time eventually takes it away. Puppets offered an escape from that reality because they remained exactly as they were. They never grew older. They never abandoned him. They never disappeared. What began as a coping mechanism gradually evolved into a world view. Instead of accepting loss as part of life, Sasori began rejecting the very nature of human existence. He stopped seeing mortality as something tragic, but meaningful. He started seeing it as a flaw that needed to be overcome. This shift may sound subtle, but it fundamentally changed the direction of his life. The more he pursued permanence, the less he valued humanity. The more he distanced himself from others, the easier it became to view people as objects rather than individuals. The more isolated he became, the less capable he was of understanding the connections that give life meaning. Eventually, even his own body became something he wanted to escape. One of the most disturbing aspects of Sasori's story is that he ultimately transformed himself into a puppet. This decision is often discussed because of its combat implications, but its emotional significance is even more important. Sasori had become so afraid of loss, aging, and impermanence that he willingly abandoned much of what made him human. He achieved the permanence he had always sought. What he lost in the process was everything else. For the hidden sand, this transformation represented another devastating failure in a long chain of failures. The village had produced one of the most gifted shinobi in its history, only to lose him completely. The child who might have helped lead Sunagakure into a brighter future. Instead, became a missing nin feared throughout the world. The consequences grew even worse when Sasori eventually turned his attention toward the third Kazekage. By this point, the village viewed the Kazekage as its greatest source of stability. He was respected, powerful, and widely regarded as the strongest leader the Hidden Sand had ever produced. His existence reassured people that the village could overcome the challenges threatening its future. Sasori destroyed that reassurance. After killing the third Kazekage, he transformed him into one of his human puppets, using the leader's iron sand abilities as a weapon. Few moments in Naruto better illustrate the tragedy of the Hidden Sand than this one. The village's greatest prodigy murdered its greatest leader and then turned his body into a tool. The symbolism is almost impossible to ignore. The future that Sunagakure had spent decades trying to build was dismantled by a product of its own suffering. When the third Kazekage disappeared, the village lost more than a leader. It lost confidence. It lost stability. It lost the sense that things were finally improving. Once again, a generation of hope gave way to another generation of uncertainty. The people of the Hidden Sand did not yet know it, but the consequences of that loss would continue shaping the village for years. Leadership would become more difficult. Economic pressures would continue growing. Fear about the future would spread through the political system. Before long, another Kazekage would inherit these problems and attempt to solve them through increasingly desperate measures. His name was Rasa, and his decisions would eventually create one of the most tragic childhoods in the entire Naruto series. By the time Rasa became the fourth Kazekage, the Hidden Sand was carrying the weight of decades of unresolved problems. The disappearance of the third Kazekage had shaken the village's confidence. Economic difficulties continued affecting nearly every aspect of daily life. Mission contracts were becoming harder to secure. Rival villages possessed greater resources and stronger political influence. While Sunagakure remained one of the 5 great villages in name, maintaining that position required more effort with each passing year. Rasa inherited all of these problems at once. This is important to remember because many discussions about Rasa focus exclusively on his treatment of Gaara, while ignoring the circumstances surrounding his leadership. None of those circumstances excuse his decisions, but they do help explain them. Rasa was not a man who ruled during a period of prosperity. He ruled during a period of decline, uncertainty, and growing fear about the future of the village. Every day brought new pressures. Every year seemed to narrow the range of available options. Every setback reinforced the belief that Sunagakure was falling behind its rivals. Unlike some leaders who inherit stable systems, Rasa spent much of his reign searching for ways to keep the village competitive. One of his most famous abilities, gold dust, was valuable not only as a weapon, but also as an economic asset. The gold he produced helped offset some of the financial difficulties facing the Land of Wind and the Hidden Sand. Even this detail reveals something important about his leadership. Rasa was not merely fighting military threats. He was fighting economic realities that threatened the village's future. The problem was that economics alone could not solve everything. The village also needed military strength. It needed deterrence. It needed something capable of convincing rival nations that the hidden sand remained a force worthy of respect. Eventually, Rasa turned toward a solution that had existed for generations: the tailed beasts. Throughout the Naruto world, Jinchuriki were often treated as military assets rather than human beings. Villages viewed them as weapons capable of shifting the balance of power. The individuals carrying these beasts frequently paid a terrible personal price, but leaders often considered that price acceptable when national security was involved. The hidden sand was no exception. The one-tail, Shukaku, had already caused enormous difficulties throughout the village's history. Previous attempts to contain its power had produced mixed results at best. Controlling a tailed beast was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking, yet the strategic benefits were difficult to ignore. A successful Jinchuriki could become one of the most powerful military assets in the entire village. For a leader struggling to secure the future of Sunagakure, the temptation was obvious. Rasa made a decision that would alter the course of the village's history. He chose his own son. Before Gaara was born, Shukaku was sealed into him while he was still in his mother's womb. The process claimed the life of Karura, Gaara's mother, turning his birth into a tragedy before he had even taken his first breath. From the very beginning, his existence became linked to sacrifice. The village gained a potential weapon, but a child entered the world carrying a burden that no one should ever have been asked to bear. The consequences appeared almost immediately. Unlike many children, Gaara never experienced a normal childhood. The power sealed inside him made people fearful. Villagers looked at him and saw danger rather than innocence. Parents warned their children to stay away from him. Whispers followed him wherever he went. The very people he was supposed to protect viewed him as a threat. This reaction created a devastating cycle. The more people feared Gaara, the more isolated he became. The more isolated he became, the less he understood human connection. The less he understood human connection, the more frightening his behavior appeared to others. With each passing year, the distance between Gaara and the rest of the village continued growing. What makes his story especially heartbreaking is that he desperately wanted acceptance. Beneath the frightening abilities and violent outbursts was a lonely child trying to understand why everyone seemed to hate him. He did not understand what he had done wrong. He did not understand why other children could laugh and play together while he remained alone. He simply knew that wherever he went, people looked at him with fear. The one source of comfort in his life was his uncle, Yashimaru. Unlike many others, Yashimaru treated Gaara with kindness. He spent time with him. He answered his questions. He provided affection during a period when almost nobody else would. For a child starving for emotional connection, that relationship became incredibly important. Gaara came to believe that Yashimaru genuinely cared about him. For a brief period, he felt less alone. Unfortunately, the history of the hidden sand rarely allows moments of hope to last for very long. As concerns about Shukaku's influence continued growing, Rasa began questioning whether Gaara could ever become the weapon he envisioned. The village needed a controllable Jinchuriki. What it had instead was a deeply troubled child whose powers were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Fear began replacing hope. The solution Rasa chose would become one of the darkest decisions in the history of Sunagakure. Rather than protecting his son, he began testing him. Rather than helping him, he began viewing him as a potential threat. And rather than treating him as a child, he increasingly treated him as a failed experiment. The tragedy was not simply that Gaara suffered. The tragedy was that the village convinced itself this suffering was necessary. Just as previous generations had sacrificed their happiness for survival, Gaara became another offering placed upon the altar of necessity. Leaders told themselves they were protecting the village. Shinobi told themselves they were carrying out their duties. Everyone had a reason for what they were doing. None of those reasons changed what was happening to the child at the center of it all. By the time Gaara reached adolescence, the hidden sand had succeeded in creating exactly what it feared. Years of rejection, isolation, and betrayal had transformed a lonely boy into someone who genuinely struggled to understand the value of human life. The village looked at him and saw a monster, never fully acknowledging how much effort had gone into creating one. Yet the worst moment of Gaara's childhood had not happened yet. The event that would completely shatter his trust in other people was still waiting in the future. When it arrived, it would destroy the last emotional bond he believed he had left and push him further into darkness than anyone thought possible. In a village already filled with tragedy, it would become one of the most painful examples of how fear and desperation can transform a child into something he was never meant to become. If there is a single moment that explains why Gaara became the person we meet at the beginning of Naruto, it is not the sealing of Shukaku. It is not the fear of the villagers. It is not even the countless assassination attempts ordered against him. The moment that truly broke Gaara was the night he learned that the one person he trusted most had never been allowed to love him at all. To understand why that moment was so devastating, it is important to remember how little affection existed in Gaara's life. From the day he was born, people treated him differently. The adults around him rarely saw a child. They saw the one tail. They saw a weapon that might one day protect the village or destroy it. Every interaction was filtered through fear. Every relationship was overshadowed by uncertainty. Even people who wanted to help him often kept their distance because they were afraid of what might happen. As the years passed, Gaara became increasingly isolated. Children avoided him. Adults whispered about him. Shinobi monitored him. The village watched him constantly, while simultaneously pretending he did not belong there. Under those circumstances, Yashimaru became more than an uncle. He became Gaara's entire emotional world. Yashimaru answered questions that nobody else would answer. He listened when Gaara spoke. He spent time with him when everyone else avoided him. Most importantly, he treated him like a person rather than a threat. For a lonely child who had never experienced genuine acceptance, those moments carried enormous meaning. Gaara believed he had finally found someone who understood him. For the first time in his life, he felt something resembling hope. That hope would not survive. As concerns about Gaara continued growing, Rasa reached an increasingly troubling conclusion. The Jinchuriki project was not producing the results he wanted. Rather than becoming a stable military asset, Gaara was becoming more emotionally unstable with every passing year. The village's fear continued increasing. Reports about his behavior became more alarming. Questions about whether he could ever be controlled became impossible to ignore. Rasa responded in the same way many leaders throughout the history of the Hidden Sand responded when faced with uncertainty. He chose a harsher solution. Repeated assassination attempts were ordered against his own son. These missions were presented as tests. If Gaara survived, then perhaps he truly was strong enough to justify the risks associated with keeping him alive. If he died, then the village would be rid of a growing problem before it became even more dangerous. The logic was ruthless. The victim was a child. Again, the Hidden Sand convinced itself that necessity justified almost anything. Gaara survived every attempt. His automatic sand defenses protected him from danger, even when he was unconscious. Assassins failed. Ambushes failed. Every effort to eliminate him ended in failure. Instead of reassuring the village, these failures only increased the fear surrounding him. People began viewing him less as a human being and more as something unnatural. The stronger he became, the more isolated he grew. Eventually, Rasa approved in final test. The man chosen for the mission was Yashimaru. The decision was cruel enough on its own, but what followed would leave permanent scars upon Gaara's psyche. During their confrontation, Yashimaru revealed information that completely shattered the foundation of Gaara's identity. He told Gaara that his mother had never loved him. He claimed that Karura blamed him for her death and hated him from the moment he was born. He suggested that his existence had brought nothing but suffering to the people around him. For a child already drowning in loneliness, those words were devastating. Gaara had spent years searching for evidence that somebody cared about him. Now he was being told that even his own mother had rejected him. The emotional damage was immediate. Everything he believed about himself collapsed. Everything he believed about love collapsed. Everything he believed about human relationships collapsed. When Yashimaru died, Gaara lost more than the closest person in his life. He lost his ability to trust. The irony is that Yashimaru's words were not entirely true. Before his death, it became clear that he was acting under orders and struggling with his own complicated emotions. Karura had actually loved Gaara deeply. Her final wish was for him to live and survive. The sand that protected him throughout his childhood was often interpreted as a manifestation of that love. Unfortunately, Gaara did not know that. What he remembered was betrayal. What he remembered was rejection. What he remembered was the realization that the last person he trusted had tried to kill him. From that point forward, his worldview changed completely. If nobody loved him, then love was meaningless. If nobody cared about him, then caring about others was pointless. If every relationship ended in betrayal, then the safest path was to rely only on himself. This philosophy became the foundation of the person viewers meet during the Chunin exams. The smiling child who once hoped for friendship disappeared. In his place emerged someone who viewed violence as proof of existence. Gaara convinced himself that his purpose was to survive at any cost and destroy anyone who threatened that survival. Killing became easier than connecting. Fear became easier than trust. The tragedy is that many people interpreted this transformation as proof that Gaara had always been a monster. Very few stopped to consider how much suffering had been required to create him. The village looked at the result and blamed the child. It rarely examined the process that produced that result. By this point, the hidden sand had reached one of the lowest points in its history. Economic problems continued mounting. Political pressures continued growing. The relationship between Sunagakure and Konoha was becoming increasingly complicated. Rasa was growing more desperate with each passing year, and desperation has a way of making dangerous ideas seem reasonable. Before long, that desperation would push the village into a decision that would change the course of Naruto's story forever. A secret alliance would be formed. A war would be planned. And the hidden sand would once again gamble its future on a strategy born from fear rather than hope. By the time Gaara entered the Chunin exams, the hidden sand was approaching a crossroads. For decades, the village had been trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. Economic struggles created political pressure. Political pressure created desperate decisions. Those desperate decisions created new tragedies, which then produced even more instability for the next generation to inherit. The names changed. The leaders changed. The circumstances changed. Yet the pattern remained remarkably consistent. The disappearance of the third Kazekage had weakened the village. The loss of Sasori had weakened the village. Years of financial decline had weakened the village. The increasingly desperate leadership of the fourth Kazekage had weakened the village. At first glance, Gaara appeared to be the final product of that cycle. When Naruto's audience first meets him, there is very little to suggest that he will one day become one of the most respected leaders in the entire shinobi world. He seems unstable, violent, and emotionally detached. He speaks about killing with disturbing calmness. He treats human life as something disposable. His presence alone makes experienced shinobi uncomfortable. Many viewers initially see Gaara as a monster. The deeper tragedy is that Gaara sees himself the same way. Years of rejection had convinced him that he existed for a different purpose than everyone else. While other people formed friendships, pursued dreams, and built meaningful relationships, Gaara viewed life through the lens of survival. He believed that his value depended entirely upon his strength. He believed that fear was the only way to secure acknowledgement from others. He believed that human connection was an illusion, because every important relationship in his life had ultimately ended in betrayal. These beliefs did not emerge naturally. They were taught. Every fearful glance from a villager reinforced them. Every assassination attempt reinforced them. Every moment of isolation reinforced them. The hidden sand had spent years creating exactly the person it feared most. At the same time, the village itself was moving toward another disastrous decision. The leadership of Sunagakure had become increasingly concerned about its declining influence. Mission contracts continued favoring the hidden leaf. Economic challenges continued mounting. Political frustrations continued growing. Many leaders within the village feared that if nothing changed, the hidden sand would gradually lose its position among the great nations. Under those circumstances, the proposal offered by Orochimaru became difficult for Rasa to ignore. The plan promised an opportunity to weaken Konoha and improve the hidden sand's standing. For a village accustomed to making sacrifices in pursuit of survival, the risks seemed worth taking. What Rasa did not realize was that Orochimaru had no intention of treating Sunagakure as an equal partner. The alliance was built upon manipulation from the beginning. Before the invasion could take place, Orochimaru assassinated the fourth Kazekage and concealed the truth. The leader who had spent years trying to secure the future of his village died without ever seeing the outcome of his choices. His reign ended much as it had been defined, by desperation, uncertainty, and the tragic belief that increasingly extreme measures were necessary for the village's survival. The invasion itself became another turning point in the history of the hidden sand. While the attack is often remembered as a major event for Konoha, it also exposed the weaknesses and frustrations that had been building within Sunagakure for years. The village had become so desperate to reverse its decline that it allowed itself to become a tool in somebody else's plans. Yet something unexpected happened during this period. For the first time in his life, Gaara encountered someone who truly understood him. Naruto's importance to Gaara's story cannot be overstated. On the surface, they were remarkably similar. Both were Jinchuriki. Both had grown up isolated from their peers. Both had experienced loneliness that few people could fully comprehend. Both spent their childhoods being judged for circumstances completely beyond their control. The difference was not what happened to them. The difference was how they responded. Naruto continued seeking connections despite the pain he experienced. Gaara abandoned the idea entirely. Naruto believed that acknowledgement could be earned through protecting others. Gaara believed that acknowledgement could only be earned through fear. Naruto continued reaching outward. Gaara retreated inward. During their confrontation, Gaara witnessed something that challenged the foundation of his entire worldview. Naruto was willing to risk everything for people he cared about. He fought not because he hated his opponents, but because he valued the bonds he had formed. The strength Naruto displayed came directly from relationships that Gaara had spent years dismissing as meaningless. For perhaps the first time, Gaara was forced to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered. What if he had been wrong? What if the loneliness consuming him was not inevitable? What if the thing he had spent his entire life rejecting was actually the answer he had been searching for? These questions lingered long after their battle ended. When Gaara returned to the hidden sand, something had changed. The hatred that once defined him no longer felt as certain. The anger that fueled his actions no longer felt as satisfying. The identity he had constructed around pain and isolation began to crack. What followed was one of the most remarkable character transformations in Naruto. Rather than continuing down the path he had followed for years, Gaara began examining the mistakes that had shaped his life. He started seeking understanding instead of domination. He started thinking about responsibility instead of revenge. Most importantly, he started considering how his strength could be used to protect others rather than separate himself from them. The significance of this transformation extends beyond Gaara himself. For generations, the hidden sand had relied upon fear. Fear of weakness, fear of failure, fear of losing influence, fear of falling behind rival nations. Those fears shaped leaders, policies, and entire generations of shinobi. They influenced decisions that produced countless tragedies throughout the village's history. Gaara represented something entirely different. He represented the possibility that the cycle could end. When he eventually became Kazekage, the symbolism was extraordinary. The child once viewed as a threat to the village had become its leader. The boy who grew up completely alone became the person responsible for protecting everyone else. The living reminder of Sunagakure's failures became the strongest evidence that the village could change. For the first time in generations, the hidden sand was being guided by someone who understood suffering from the perspective of its victims rather than its leaders. Gaara knew what it felt like to be sacrificed for the sake of the village. He knew what it felt like to be treated as a tool instead of a person. He knew what it felt like to carry burdens that no child should ever be forced to carry. Because of that experience, he became the kind of leader the village had needed for a very long time. Not the strongest, not the most feared, not the most politically influential, the most compassionate. And in a village whose history had been defined by hardship, sacrifice, and loss, compassion turned out to be the thing capable of succeeding where strength alone had repeatedly failed. When Gaara became the 5th Kazekage, he was still remarkably young. In most villages, such a promotion would have raised serious concerns. Leadership positions were usually given to individuals with decades of experience, extensive political connections, and long records of military service. The responsibilities of a Kage were enormous, and the consequences of poor leadership could affect an entire nation. Yet, in the hidden sand, Gaara's appointment felt almost inevitable. The village had spent generations placing its faith in strength, military power, and increasingly desperate attempts to secure its future. Those approaches had produced temporary successes, but they had also produced many of the tragedies that defined Sunagakure's history. The people needed something different. They needed a leader capable of breaking patterns that had existed for decades. Ironically, the person best suited for that role was someone who had suffered more than almost anyone else in the village. Gaara understood the consequences of fear because fear had shaped his entire childhood. He understood the damage caused by treating people as tools because he had spent years being treated that way himself. He understood how easily leaders could convince themselves that cruelty was justified when pursuing what they believed to be a greater good. These experiences gave him a perspective that previous Kazekage often lacked. For much of its history, the hidden sand had been governed by leaders forced to focus almost exclusively on survival. Their decisions were influenced by military concerns, economic struggles, and the constant pressure of competing against stronger nations. While many of those leaders genuinely wanted to protect their people, they often became trapped by circumstances that encouraged short-term solutions rather than long-term healing. Gaara inherited many of the same challenges. The village was still recovering from years of instability. Economic problems had not magically disappeared. Political difficulties still existed. Relationships with other nations still required careful management. The difference was that Gaara approached these problems from a fundamentally different direction. Rather than relying upon fear, he emphasized trust. Rather than demanding loyalty through intimidation, he earned it through example. Rather than viewing people primarily as military assets, he viewed them as individuals whose lives possessed inherent value. This shift may sound simple, but its impact upon the village was profound. For generations, many citizens had accepted hardship as an unavoidable part of life. They had grown accustomed to leaders making painful sacrifices in pursuit of stability. They had learned to endure suffering because suffering seemed woven into the identity of the hidden sand itself. Gaara challenged that assumption. His leadership suggested that survival and compassion did not have to exist in opposition to one another. A village could remain strong without sacrificing its humanity. It could defend itself without abandoning its values. It could pursue security without creating new generations of broken children. One of the clearest examples of this transformation appeared in the way the village itself began viewing Gaara. As a child, he had been feared. As a teenager, he had been distrusted. As Kazekage, he became respected. This change was not the result of propaganda or political manipulation. It happened because people witnessed his actions. They saw a leader willing to place himself in danger for others. They saw someone who understood suffering and therefore refused to ignore it. They saw a person who possessed enormous power, but chose to use it responsibly. Over time, the same villagers who once looked at him with suspicion began looking at him with admiration. The significance of this change cannot be overstated. For most of his childhood, Gaara believed he was fundamentally incapable of being loved. He believed his existence brought pain to everyone around him. He believed that fear was the only emotion he could inspire in others. Becoming Kazekage forced him to confront the fact that these beliefs were not true. The village that once rejected him eventually accepted him. The people who once feared him eventually trusted him. The child who spent years searching for a reason to exist eventually found one. This transformation reached its most powerful moment during the events involving the Akatsuki. By this point, Gaara had become one of the most respected leaders among the younger generation of Kage. However, his status as the host of the One Tail also made him a target. The Akatsuki had begun hunting Jinchuriki throughout the world, and Gaara's position placed him directly in their path. When Deidara attacked the hidden sand, Gaara faced a choice that perfectly demonstrated how much he had changed. Years earlier, he would have focused solely on defeating his opponent. Years earlier, he would have prioritized his own survival. Years earlier, he might have viewed other people as secondary concerns. Instead, he chose to protect the village, even when doing so placed him at a disadvantage, even when doing so increased the risk to his own life, even when doing so ultimately contributed to his defeat. The battle revealed something extraordinary. The boy who once believed only in himself had become a leader, willing to sacrifice himself for everyone else. The symbolism could not have been more powerful. The same village that had transformed him into a weapon was now being protected by him. The same people who once viewed him as a monster were now the people he risked everything to save. The same child who grew up completely alone had become the heart of an entire community. Although the Akatsuki succeeded in capturing him, the reaction of the hidden sand revealed just how dramatically the village had changed. Citizens mourned him. Shinobi rallied around him. Friends and allies fought desperately to bring him home. For perhaps the first time in his life, Gaara experienced something he had spent years believing was impossible. People genuinely cared whether he lived or died. That reality represented more than personal growth. It represented the healing of an entire village. The hidden sand had spent generations sacrificing individuals for the sake of survival. Now, it was risking everything to save one of its own. The transformation was not perfect, and many challenges still remained, but it demonstrated that the cycle governing the village's history was finally beginning to break. For the first time in a very long time, the future of Sunagakure seemed brighter than its past. And after everything the village had endured, that alone felt almost miraculous. By the beginning of the Fourth Great Ninja War, something remarkable had happened within the hidden sand. For the first time in its history, the village was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. That statement might sound simple, but when viewed against everything Sunagakure had endured, it represented a transformation decades in the making. The village that entered the war was not the same village that had created Gaara. It was not the same village that lost Sasori. It was not the same village that watched the third Kazekage disappear. It was not the same village that spent years sacrificing its future in desperate attempts to survive the present. The scars remained, but the mindset had changed. That distinction is important because the true curse of the hidden sand was never poverty, geography, or military weakness. Those problems created hardship, but they were not the root cause of the village's suffering. The deeper problem was that every generation became trapped by the fears of the generation before it. Leaders inherited insecurity and passed it forward. Parents inherited trauma and unknowingly passed it forward. Entire communities inherited a belief that survival required sacrifice. And over time, that belief became so deeply embedded in the culture that few people ever stopped to question it. The result was a village that repeatedly hurt the very people it was trying to protect. Sasori lost his parents because of war. Chayo spent decades carrying regrets created by war. Gaara lost his childhood because leaders feared weakness. Rasa lost his humanity because he feared failure. Even the ordinary citizens of Sunagakure spent much of their lives carrying anxieties created by problems that had existed long before they were born. The tragedy of the hidden sand was never a single event. It was a cycle that continued for so long that many people stopped believing it could ever end. What makes this history particularly fascinating is that there was rarely a true villain responsible for most of the village's suffering. In Konoha, people can point to figures like Orochimaru, Danzo, Obito, or Madara when discussing major disasters. In the Hidden Mist, much of the suffering can be traced to corrupt leadership and outside manipulation. In the Hidden Rain, generations were devastated by larger nations, treating the country like a battlefield. The Hidden Sand's story is different. Most of the people involved genuinely wanted to help. Most leaders believed they were acting responsibly. Most sacrifices were made in pursuit of security. That is what makes the village's history feel so tragic. The people creating these disasters often believed they were preventing even greater disasters from happening. Every difficult decision seemed justified in the moment. Every sacrifice appeared necessary. Every compromise felt temporary. Yet the consequences continued accumulating. One generation solved immediate problems while unknowingly creating long-term ones. Then the next generation inherited those consequences and repeated the process. Then the generation after that inherited an even heavier burden. When viewed from this perspective, Gaara's rise to power becomes far more significant than simply becoming Kazekage. He represents the first major break in the cycle. Throughout the history of the Hidden Sand, leaders often viewed people as resources that needed to be managed. This mindset did not emerge because they were cruel. It emerged because decades of hardship conditioned them to think in terms of survival above all else. Villages needed soldiers. Villages needed deterrence. Villages needed military strength. Individual suffering was frequently viewed as an unfortunate but acceptable cost. Gaara understood exactly where that mentality led because he had lived through its consequences. Unlike previous leaders, he knew what it felt like to be treated as a weapon instead of a child. He knew what it felt like to be feared by the people he wanted to protect. He knew what it felt like to grow up believing that his existence only brought pain to others. Those experiences gave him something many previous Kazekage lacked: perspective. The same suffering that nearly destroyed him eventually allowed him to understand others more deeply than most leaders ever could. This became especially apparent during the Fourth Great Ninja War. By that point, Gaara had evolved into one of the most respected figures among the younger generation of Kage. The transformation was extraordinary when compared to the person viewers met during the Chunin exams. Years earlier, he struggled to understand why anyone would risk their life for another person. Now he was standing before thousands of shinobi from different nations, encouraging them to fight together for a shared future. More importantly, people listened. The child once viewed as a monster had become someone capable of inspiring an entire army. The symbolism behind that moment is difficult to overstate. For generations, the hidden sand had searched for salvation through power. It searched through military strength. It searched through weapons. It searched through increasingly desperate political decisions. In the end, the person who changed the village's future was not its strongest warrior or its most brilliant strategist. It was the person who understood suffering better than anyone else. That realization says everything about the history of Sunagakure. The village spent decades believing strength would save it. What ultimately saved it was empathy. The village spent decades believing fear would keep it safe. What ultimately strengthened it was trust. The village spent decades sacrificing individuals for the collective good. What ultimately transformed it was learning the value of the individual. When people describe the hidden sand as Naruto's most cursed village, they are not usually referring to supernatural curses or ancient prophecies. They are talking about a place where tragedy became so common that entire generations began accepting it as normal. They are talking about a village where hardship shaped culture, leadership, and identity for decades. They are talking about a nation that repeatedly found itself caught between survival and suffering. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Hidden Sands history is that it eventually escaped that fate. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change its future. And for a village whose story had been defined by loss for so long, that achievement may have been the greatest victory it ever accomplished. When examining the history of the Hidden Sand, from beginning to end, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Nearly every major tragedy that shaped the village can be traced back to a single underlying problem: the constant struggle to survive in a world that rarely gave Sunagakure room to breathe. Unlike the Hidden Leaf, which benefited from fertile land, powerful clans, and a stronger economic foundation, the Hidden Sand was forced to build its future in one of the harshest environments in the shinobi world. Scarcity shaped its economy, geography shaped its military strategy, and uncertainty shaped its culture. Generation after generation grew up understanding that survival could never be taken for granted. While other villages certainly faced their own hardships, few were forced to carry the same combination of economic, political, and environmental burdens for such a long period of time. Over the decades, these pressures began influencing nearly every important decision made by the village's leadership. Kazekage inherited problems that had accumulated for years before they ever took office. Military leaders were forced to think about threats that extended far beyond the battlefield. Families learned to accept sacrifices that would have seemed unbearable under different circumstances. What began as practical adaptations to difficult conditions gradually evolved into a mindset that affected the entire village. That mindset produced some of the most tragic stories in Naruto. The loss of Sasori's parents transformed a gifted child into a lonely prodigy who spent years searching for permanence in a world defined by loss. Chiyo devoted her life to serving the village, only to spend her later years reflecting on the consequences of choices made during endless cycles of conflict. The disappearance of the third Kazekage shattered a period of stability that many believed would secure the future of Sunagakure. Rasa inherited a village already struggling under enormous pressure, and slowly became convinced that increasingly desperate solutions were necessary to preserve what remained. The story of Gaara ultimately brought all of these themes together. His childhood was not an isolated tragedy, but rather the culmination of decades of fear, insecurity, and difficult decisions made by people who believed they were protecting the village. Long before he was born, conditions were already being created that would shape his life. Economic decline increased pressure on leadership. Political uncertainty encouraged more extreme policies. Military concerns pushed leaders toward solutions that prioritized power over compassion. By the time Gaara entered the world, the cycle had already been repeating itself for generations. What makes his story so powerful is that he eventually became the first person capable of breaking that cycle. Throughout most of the village's history, leadership had been driven by the fear of losing something. Leaders feared losing influence, losing security, losing military strength, or losing the village itself. Those fears were understandable given the circumstances, but they often encouraged decisions focused on immediate survival rather than long-term healing. Gaara represented a completely different approach. Because he personally experienced the consequences of those decisions, he understood something many previous leaders never fully grasped. A village could survive external threats and still damage itself from within if it lost sight of the people it existed to protect. As Kazekage, Gaara became living proof that strength and compassion were not opposites. He demonstrated that protecting people required more than military power. It required trust. It required understanding. It required recognizing the humanity of individuals who might otherwise be viewed as tools, weapons, or sacrifices for a greater cause. The child who had once been treated as a burden became the leader most capable of preventing others from suffering the same fate. Viewed from that perspective, the history of the hidden sand becomes far more than a collection of tragic events. It becomes a story about how communities respond to hardship across generations. It becomes a story about the dangers of allowing fear to dictate important decisions for too long. Most importantly, it becomes a story about the possibility of change, even after decades of mistakes, suffering, and loss. This is ultimately what separates Sunagakure from many other villages in Naruto. The hidden sand was not defined by a single villain, a single war, or a single catastrophic event. Its history was shaped by countless, difficult choices made over many decades, with each generation attempting to solve problems inherited from the one before it. Some of those choices helped the village survive. Others created consequences that lasted for years. Together, they formed one of the most complex and emotionally compelling histories in the entire series. By the end of Naruto, the hidden sand remained a desert village facing many of the same geographic challenges it had always faced. The environment had not changed. Resources were still limited. The realities of the shinobi world remained difficult and unpredictable. Yet the village itself had changed in a far more important way. For the first time in its history, it was no longer trapped by the assumptions that had governed previous generations. The people of Sunagakure had learned that survival alone was not enough. A village also needed hope, trust, and leaders capable of understanding the burdens carried by ordinary people. After generations spent enduring hardship, the hidden sand finally began moving toward a future that was not controlled entirely by the fears of the past. Perhaps that is why the story of Sunagakure continues to resonate so strongly with fans. Beneath the battles, political conflicts, and legendary shinobi lies a much more human story about resilience. It is the story of people who repeatedly faced adversity and continued moving forward despite setbacks that might have broken other communities. It is the story of families, leaders, and entire generations struggling to create something better than what they inherited. For a village that spent so much of its history defined by loss, that achievement may have been its greatest victory of all. The hidden sand did not overcome every challenge, nor did it erase the tragedies that shaped its past. What it accomplished was something arguably more meaningful. It proved that even after decades of hardship, fear, and sacrifice, a community can still choose a different path, and in doing so, create a future that is better than the one it once believed was inevitable.